And we are back a little later than planned. Apologies for that, but Database 1.2 is now ready. So let's get into the news. This is a fast news show of gaming technology, game news, all the kind of good information that may or may not have come out in the week as ahead or just behind us. Not been a busy one, but there are some things to discuss, and probably biggest is the AMD V-cache and the final release of their 5800X 3D CPU, the very first CPU that has a 3D cache on it. So the PC news is where to start, and with the ever diminishing returns we get on silicon performance boosts, sheer compute, bandwidth, reducing the size of the die itself, all those other areas, and get performance improvements that still grab headlines. And many companies have been pushing even harder on more orthogonal solutions to keep Moore's law alive. I mean, IBM recently showed off, last year sometime, its latest Z server Teleum CPU, which has got a huge 32 megabyte L2 cache, and then that is actually semi-unified, it's semi-private, with its L3. So that's shared across all the cores within the chip itself, creating a 256 megabytes of L3 cache with very low latency, and it's a phenomenal improvement, and that's a big area that obviously PC is going towards, obviously technology as a whole, because cache is a very, very big part. And we now have the first commercial available CPU in that 5800X 3D that's been released from AMD. And it's got a whopping 64 megabytes of L3 cache stacked on top of the CPU die with a chemically cleaned bond. So that creates a total of 96 megabytes of cache on die. And this has the potential to make huge improvements in games, and certainly ones that are very dynamic or incoherent enough to have high cache misses, which is a very common cost. This will obviously not affect all engines or games, and in sheer frame rates above 1440p it probably won't be that relevant. But many titles should see huge increases, and certainly far more consistency due to this epic increase. And for example, the 5800X, which it replaces, only has a third of that total space, so 32 megabyte of L3. Over on the great work that the guys at Hardware Unboxed have done, they tested these two chips, and even with the higher clocks of the 3800X over the 3D model, they saw some promising increases to frame highs and 1% lows. A set of course, I saw 43% increase in average frame rates to the 5800X's favour, and 53% on the lows. COD Warzone saw 26% on average higher frame rates at 1080p, and the best news was the public UE5 title in Fortnite, the only one so far, saw 27% on average at 1080p and 1440p, with even a 19% boost at 4K, which means the CPU could do wonders for Unreal Engine 5 titles, and it may need it. As per my analysis of that City demo last week, it suffers a great deal on cache misses and other areas by the looks of things. Again, can't go into detail, but certainly the nanite technology on my RTX 2070 and the readback was a massive cost. It's more expensive with Lumen on the AMD GPU, surprisingly enough, but again, that's with a 3600X, which is a much faster CPU, and that can hover somewhere 30 and above, so that does perform better than the 2700. Overall though, this does really cover what I talked about a few years ago, and that's around that infinity cache and why these are vital, with the time lost or the latency for each level of cache getting much higher than it is to main RAM and VRAM, be it system or VRAM. It's effectively a lifetime in comparison when you go from local chip cache, then back to memory to bring it back into cache and then use it in your registers. There's a lot of cycles. I discussed that and showed off very clean examples of what that actually means in terms of why it's important and why it's the best bang for buck in terms of getting more on the die. The fact that they can stack it now means they can have two dies and they join that together, and that's very, very good. Overall though, it's best to check out a better description of why that all works by going and check out that other video. So it's the reason why faster clocks on CPUs and GPUs help, because that improves the cache speed, which means you get even lower latency and you get faster reads and you get faster pullback. So it can be a huge impact when you're going to system RAM, not only just for speed but also for power. It draws a lot more power when you go to system RAM, and that's why it's a bad situation when you're missing data. And with a cache this size, 96 megabytes of cache, then if you should be able to fit pretty much most of your data in a frame. and therefore you're not getting the cost that you can see quite heavily, and that's why we're seeing such huge improvements that Hardware Unbox have shown there. So great work from them. Wish I could get hold of a CPU, but there's none available at all, and they are quite expensive. You know, I'm self-funded, so I can't keep spending money on all these things just out of my own pocket, but it is something that I would love to dive into and have a look at in terms of, you know, overall what the higher increases are for equal CPUs, as we saw with the 5800X, and obviously against Intel, which it really is pushing hard against them as well. And AMD must be commended here for slimming down the entire CPU design, enabling it to fit into the current AM4 board. I really appreciate the fact that they've done that. And it's a massive cost saving because you can use your old board, and they've really dragged those through. And Intel, you know, have again gone for a new design, a new socket. So that just makes the whole thing far more expensive because you've got to upgrade pretty much everything at this point, including going to DDR5. This uses DDR4. So I can see this being a huge part of Zen 4 when it drops, and I could see faster clocks and even larger L3. So that increase on this could get epic, quite literally, as I've just mentioned. So yeah, looking forward to seeing and testing more on the technology as always, and I love the fact that things are always evolving. And that's probably a good segue into my Matrix and UE5 coverage. Check it out if you haven't seen it already, and it does show how expensive data cache misses, you know, all the thrashing of those areas. That data is, if it's not in the cache, you can't do it. So CPU, GPUs can't do anything if it's not in the cache. So fundamentally, a lot of those aspects I talk about on my channel a lot in terms of it's not all about teraflops and just frequency. There's a lot more that goes into it. These show very striking results. And as I state, the PC market is vast and varied. So a great deal of variation can happen on this demo, which is by no means a shippable product. Let's be clear, this is a very rough demo with lots of areas, and I discuss it in the video where it can be improved. But the examples here do really highlight the challenges ahead, and also that a great deal can be improved both in software and hardware. And these are early days, so I do know that some of you are worried because a lot of you have mentioned it on my chat and mentioned it on Patreon as well. So what does this actually mean for PCs and consoles? But I'm confident that UE5 will significantly improve a lot of these areas on all games, and not just the fact that they're going to be very dynamic. They're not going to use this kind of level of stress. They're not going to be procedurally generated everywhere, and therefore this is very demanding on the scope, and this is probably worst case scenario. But even Epic themselves and other teams that are going to use UE5 will get more used to this. They'll streamline it, they'll optimize all of those areas. I don't like that, using that word, because it gets misconstrued all the time. But they can definitely maximize the throughput and tailor it for the individual hardware. So I'm sure we'll see big improvements. So next up is finally VRR on the PlayStation 5. Obviously we all knew this was coming, and I did hold off to do this video and another one that I'm working on. But yeah, it's the day that we've all been waiting for. We can all rest easy now, can't we? That VRR will now save everything. All our frame drops, all our performance reviews. They'll all be the thing of the past because there's no issues anymore. We can just turn VRR on and everything will be fine. Obviously, if you listen to some. In reality, though, as I say, VRR on the PS5 has taken a great deal of time to land, but it's now here for all of us to revel in. And Sony and other teams are releasing patches to enable this to be activated on TVs that support it. And the operating system itself has an option to force this on even when they don't. So I will be covering this in more detail over on IGN this week, so to be sure to jump over there and check it out on my performance review when it drops very soon. I discussed this a few weeks back on the options here, and I already covered in VRR in depth already with my first capture card that supports it, the Elgato HD60X. So do check out that ahead of the PS5 VR review that I'll be covering. Again though, keep expectations in check on what it can fix and what it can't, what its main purpose is and what it actually does. But it's great that titles can now benefit from reduced tearing, improved consistency and input times when performance hiccups occur, within reason at least. And it wouldn't be right if Insomniac didn't rush out of the gate with a huge update. As you can see here, Ratchet & Clank, Spider-Man, they've all been updated with VRR, but they've gone one better and actually allowed the frame rate to run right up to 120 FPS. And as you can see in Ratchet & Clank and other titles, it can get somewhere to 100 FPS at certain points. And obviously it improves all that performance and input times, and if it does tear, it really does make a big difference. So yeah, I'll be covering all this over on IGN, so please check that out soon. There'll be a lot there to discuss. And this just really leaves Sony to add that 1440p output mode, which I think if they did, the world would finally be at peace. Maybe. Some retro news, got to get some retro news in, big thing for me. So obviously a big computer, huge computer for me and millions of other Brits and Europeans is now 40 years old, if only I was. Ah, those are the days. The Spectrum, the ZX Spectrum, to give it its full Christian name, was a revolution and no mistake. It really ushered in a paradigm which many cannot fathom now. Before the US console market imploded in 83, 84, across this side of the pond and elsewhere, consoles had long since been replaced anyway by the micro market. And thanks to that bedroom coding boom the ZX and the C64 enabled, we were flooded with a brand new market of gaming, home finance, programming and more to even notice anything had occurred on the other markets across the world. The sheer creativity, fun, excitement and divergence of titles, teams, genres and ideas were relentless. It was a simpler, happier time as the box art, word of mouth and crash reviews themselves were all you had to go on to find out whether a game was worth picking up or not. And because you didn't have that much money and there wasn't money to pick from, when you did pick something up, even if it was crap, you stuck in there, you stuck it out to make sure that that game got the most value for you. Occasionally you could always trade them with your mates if you wanted to and share them. Which obviously really started the copying problem. That was piracy was a big problem back then. It was unfortunate. You know, a lot of people have these. I love these retro channels everywhere where everyone's got all these stuff in the background and they got all these games on shelves. And no one was like that back then. It looked like this: discs, tapes everywhere, recordings. That was how it actually was. So no one had that kind of money to spend on games. It was expensive, relatively, probably. More expensive than it is now, in fact. You know, £10-12 games for £14.99. £20 games for the Amiga. £20 games in the 80s. I mean, just that's relative. What's that now? About 80 quid. So yeah, relatively, there was a very expensive hobby. Anyway, I'm digressing now, having an old man yells at cloud moment. Yeah, back to the whole Spectrum itself, the ZX Spectrum. It can't be understated how pioneering the late Sir Clive Sinclair, the lead engineer, Richard Altwazar, I think it was, and obviously the late great Rick Dickinson, who designed the iconic and infamous ZX Speccy, including those rubber keys that everyone loved. Each design actually was bettering his last. The ZX80, the ZX81. I think his design for the Spectrum Next is glorious, and it's such a shame that the man never got to see it launch, and that is a real tragedy. Now, although I was not a Speccy fan for long, because the C64 stole my eye only a mere few months later in 83, the Spectrum was still a huge machine, and many of my mates only had the Spectrum, or more accurately, they chose it as their weapon of choice, and I could not disagree, as it was rammed with classic titles such as Dizzy, Manic Miner, Jetpack, Attic Attack, Ant Attack, many, many more. There's just so many games on it that I used to play, and they used to wax lyrical for me in the playground and even around the house. So we used to go around each other's houses and share games and, you know, play games on each of the C64 or, you know, later on in the Amiga and the ST. And they used to go on and on about the brilliance and the quality of the Spectrum over the C64. And sometimes I even let them think they were right on that. But yeah, generally, the Speccy was an absolute amazing piece of kit. And it really kind of pioneered a lot of things that we take for granted now in terms of having a cheap, affordable home console or home computer that you can do a lot of things on. And it really was revolutionary. There's a lot of evolution from then, and they kind of killed themselves in some way. Sinclair just went completely mad with some very bad business choices throughout their legacy. And I remember it quite vividly because I was working in a computer shop towards mid-85, 86. And we had a lot of problems with Speccy because the market was just confusing. They were confusing everybody with the things they did with the 128K stuff and not actually releasing it in the UK, but people knew about it even then. So, you know, and the Dixon's branding and all that kind of weird and wonderful stuff. So it was a very unstructured time back then, and there was a lot of deals made directly with big market providers. Dixon's was a huge brand, you know, like Rumbelows and places like that. People remember back then in the UK. They were a huge market, and you used to get a lot of brands, pack-ins, and specific deals that you could go in and actually play the Spectrum in the classroom, in a section in the area, and then obviously you had WH Smith with their special brands, and even then, developers back then could actually, you know, make a game and go to a shop and sell it in certain stores. So there was games that were released in certain stores that were just, you know, WH Smith and Woolworths that weren't across the nation. And if they were really good, they then got spread out across the nation. So I do miss those heady times, and I think the Spectrum and the C64 really sum those up in terms of when I think the golden age of gaming was. It really was a kind of a home market then. you could literally live in your house on your own and make a fortune. You know, Manic Miner was a good example of it. So there's loads of titles that really were revolutionary. Bug Bite Software, I think that was. I'm looking at my shelf now. Can't see which one it was, but yeah, I think it was. But yeah, the Spectrum, an incredible machine, 40 years old, and it really makes me feel old looking back and remembering that so vividly in that kind of time that really kind of inspired me to do a lot of what I did and what I do as a living. So yeah, great stuff. Sorry to wax lyrical about retro stuff, but a lot of this is very near and dear to me, and it is something that I'll be covering more and more. And that kind of brings us on to content on the channel. I know I've gone about this for a couple of months now, and I do apologise, but my long-awaited Neon 250 versus the Dreamcast video is definitely in the works. I did want to do some more stuff on it and kind of wrap up a few more bits and bobs, and that unfortunately went 3 weeks, 4 weeks before I could get back to it again. But I have and was working on it over the weekend, so that is coming very soon for my patrons. It'll be up later on for everyone else, but I'm going to start holding these retro ones off longer and bigger so the patrons have a reason to subscribe. So if you do like this kind of stuff and you are looking forward to that, then please hit my Patreon up. It really helps because, again, I'm completely independent and this is a side project, so it is kind of time consuming and cost expensive to do all these kind of retro stuff with the time and detail that I want to put in. So they wouldn't be possible without Patreon people doing them. In fact, that's the only reason I can do retro stuff, because there's money there that they're paying me, and it really helps me spend the time and investment on that, because otherwise if I'm not doing a video, I'm not making any money at all, and it all becomes a moot point. So hopefully you guys will enjoy that. It really is quite detailed and in-depth, and there's a lot of testing there in terms of the hardware and what things were going on at the time. So fingers crossed you will all love it. Like I say, I've got the VRR PS5 stuff on IGN, some other stuff for IGN as well coming up, so there's some work coming that's just kicked off now and there. And I've got some other plans to finish off a few bits and bobs that I have finished. I've pretty much got a Horizon video against PC finished. I just need to narrate it. I haven't done it yet. I've done all the capture and the comparisons and all that kind of good stuff, but I just haven't narrated it in terms of keeping it on point and making it tight. So I will be doing that as well. And there are big releases coming up in May, so keep an eye out for things that we can cover on there, and there's lots more stuff to do. And in that spirit, I need to sadly call this to a close. So I've only got time for 2 questions on this one, but there was a few came in, so I do really appreciate them. Again, if you are a patron, please leave your comment. Your question can be about anything, technology, me, gaming, anything at all. Just throw it in there, and I'll try and answer it on that. That's what the Q&A is for. It's anything at all, so please throw that in there. The first one is from Unicron. Thank you very much, Unicron. You're very efficient at getting some questions over to me, so I do really appreciate it. He asked, how far do you think Nintendo can go with the hybrid model? Repeat what they've done again, but obviously on a more powerful machine than a handheld-only variant. Do you think they'll use Qualcomm ARM chipsets or MediaTek instead of NVIDIA in the future? Good question. Nintendo's always Nintendo. They other than the GameCube, which is the last time they were bleeding edge, they won't do that again. So pretty sure they'll stay with NVIDIA. Pretty sure they'll go with something that uses DLSS, because it will make perfect sense for the options to run the base resolution on the handheld and then DLSS up to a high resolution on the screen, so therefore 4K comes into it. Pretty sure they'll use the Tegra or a derivative thereof in terms of what it will actually be powered by. It might even be a newer one. They might go a little bit further forward. NVIDIA might supplement it a little bit and give them a good deal because of the market share that they've got and the fact that they're in that console space, so that puts them in good position against AMD. So that's a strategic and a very commercial decision now, I think, that they would choose to do that. So yeah, I absolutely think that they'll stay with NVIDIA. I think the solution will be PS4-ish, maybe better. There'll probably be higher resolutions than PS4, but visual quality, overall performance and battery life and all that are a big part of that. So I'm sure they'll innovate with something else, because that's just Nintendo. They will innovate. So maybe they go with a VR option. That could be an option that they choose. They might choose to have glasses that work. You know, you see all the things they've done with prior to this in terms of branching out their box construction and all those areas they've moved into, and use the cardboard VR and all that. So I'm pretty sure that they'll do something in addition to just better technology. It'll be OLED, obviously, because they've already done an OLED, and OLEDs are now so proficient and they're everywhere. They're ubiquitous now, so the cost kind of comes down drastically. So it'd be more expensive for them not to do OLED, I think, than for them to do OLED. And I don't think it'll be a drastic shift. I think it'll be a more powerful version of the Switch. Like I say, somewhere in between the PS4 and the PS4 Pro, probably, if we're lucky. But it will probably, you know, do well, maybe. There's never a thing with Nintendo because everything's like, you know, the N64 was a complete disaster for various reasons. It was too long. It took too long to get to market. They kept previewing it and telling you to wait till we say so, and the arrogance levels there were really high, and the Ultra 64 name and all that confusion that came with it. And the Dolphin kind of had the same problem, you know, with the GameCube. So it was only the Super Nintendo where they kind of waited, and they still managed to claw back a lot of the market. Not really in the UK, probably right at the very end, but the Mega Drive really took the impact there. And I think, again, the Wii was a good example of you know, them smashing it, and then the Wii U was an absolute disaster because it wasn't sufficiently different. So I think they've learned the lesson, maybe, and that's what they're trying to do, is reinvent it. There's no point in releasing under the Switch when it's just slightly better with slightly better graphics and a faster frame rate. Hardcore will buy it, yeah, but, you know, then again, I didn't think the Switch would do as well as it did, so it shows that, you know, you can't do everything. Things can change, so yeah, it will be interesting to see. Next question was from Savage Yuga, and this one is around Microsoft and Sony are looking into machine learning upscaling, and that consoles have a limited amount of tops, at least compared to NVIDIA RTX for DLSS. Would it be possible that we would see hybrid solutions like essentially checkerboard plus machine learning upscaling? Yeah, absolutely. Whether they would or whether you'll get one or t'other, again, it might not make much sense to run both because they can be very expensive. So the TSR on Unreal Engine 5, as I've seen from the PC analysis, can take upwards of 3 milliseconds on an RTX 2070 at certain points in the title, and there's still, you know, quite a lot of issues there in terms of that, the denoising filter that goes with the ray traced elements and the path tracing parts. So there's a lot of stuff that will absolutely be required, and Sony have worked long and hard. I said at the beginning of the generation, resolutions are kind of pointless beyond a certain point, and certainly counting them is very hard because there's various buffers anyway, so everything's kind of merged. So I think we'll get things like foveated rendering, which we've seen in PSVR 2, which has now become a hardware solution, eye tracking. So yeah, there's absolutely loads of areas there, and I think machine learning will work well in VR because that would work well with the algorithms in terms of working out where your eyes are going and how to structure an image, and that could become a learning process if it was that clever. I mean, there's not enough hardware in there to do that, and certainly space, but there's a lot of areas where machine learning could do great work with reconstruction images, and we've seen that already. And I think, you know, the RTX cards have a great solution in DLSS. It's not completely, you know, infallible, and it doesn't mean that there's nothing that can't be improved, and it always will be improved. But I think when it comes to video games, and certainly VR, I think there's a lot of scope here to use various solutions, and whether or not machine learning takes a foothold in consoles or even generally, you know, it might not. I've already said this before, with so many options now out there in terms of using compute, as things become more powerful, it probably makes more sense to just utilize those ALUs and write it as a compute algorithm job rather than dedicate hardware that's specific for it, and then have all that work around training your machine learning to regenerate the image in the best way. You know, that base level that you have in terms of teaching it the foundations, and then you move it on to the next stage of learning. So supervise it, then unsupervise it, and then it works out its own paths. Machine learning can get very, very complicated, but image quality, I think, is one that would work very, very well with it, certainly in a fixed function piece of hardware like a console. So I think we'll see options taken. I don't think we'll see both together. I'll be surprised if we do. And take into account that it will use dynamic resolution scaling along with any temporal solution, be that TSR or even machine learning. Again, sorry if that's not the best answer, and sorry if I'm running out of time. This is already a week late, and I've got a lot of things going on. So apologies again for everyone that this wasn't as in-depth. There's not a lot of news, but hopefully enough here to keep you entertained. And hopefully this is a good process still and you still enjoy it. I will try and make more time from next week and try and dedicate a couple of hours of my day just to do this and do the conversation in peace and quiet, because a busy household with kids, wife and all that kind of stuff, you know what it's like. So it was a bit chaotic today, and I just tried to grab the time to do it. Anyway, that's it. Remember, if you do like what I do here on IGN, all the work that I put together, I'm completely self-funded, so do help subscribe and share. Do leave comments down below. Do share this video where appropriate and give a thumbs up. All of the interaction really helps YouTube promote the video, and it gets more views, and that really helps my, you know, channel grow, and that's important. Hopefully lots of good stuff coming up. Everyone keep pinned to the channel and over on IGN as well, and I'll catch you on the next one. Thank you.